International astronauts and cosmonauts, all members of the Association of Space Explorers, gathered in September 2008 at the University of Washington in Seattle for 2 panel discussions: International Space Programs Review and Human Health for Long-Duration Exploration. This program is part of a series featuring Dr. Bonnie Dunbar, former NASA astronaut, discussing human health for long-duration exploration, followed by a panel discussion with astronauts Cady Coleman, Paola Nespoli, Akihiko Hoshide, Dr. Millie Hughes-Fulford, Dr. Bonnie Dunbar, and cosmonauts Reinhold Ewald and Pavel Vinogradov.
Good morning. My name is Phyllis Wise, and I'm the provost here at the University of Washington. And I want to really welcome you here to the 21st Planetary Congress. We are thrilled to have you here, excited about the work that you do, and really want to have the connections between the University of Washington and you even better. Your work has led to such a better understanding of space, of the atmosphere of our environment, and have developed so many international collaborations that have helped this work go forward. The UW is deeply connected with space. As the home of Boeing, we have been very, very interested in the development of flight and the technology that goes behind that. There are at least 8 different UW graduates who have been involved with NASA space flights, the latest of which is Greg Johnson, who will be piloting the last shuttle flight to the Hubble Space Telescope, and that is scheduled to take off in October, on October 8th. So many of our children and young people, some of whom are sitting here in the audience, dream of becoming astronauts, and we hope that the training and the exposure to the work that you do will encourage them even further. Our departments of astronautics and aeronautics, astronomy, atmospheric sciences, and earth and space sciences are proud contributors to the work that you do. And so I also want to recognize Bonnie Dunbar, the chair of the Washington State ASE Coordinating Committee, who has made sure that these days here that you will spend here are good and productive for you. I just want to say that I know that some of the participants are stuck in Houston, but I'm sure that this Congress will be very, very rich and very important to your continuing collaborations. And what I'd like to do now is introduce the leader, the panel leader of this discussion for you today.
It is regrettable that Dr. Sutton and Dr. Charles can't be with us today. John heads a group in biomedical risk assessment for NASA, identifies the risks based on history, based on research that points the way to future research. Dr. Sutton heads the NASA National Space Biomedical Research Institute that coordinates research across the nation. There are what they call the top-tier universities that conduct that research. It's all peer-reviewed research. And then partner universities. The University of Washington here is one of those top-tier universities, a member of the NSBRI. And there are 3 principal investigators that are engaged in research to help us stay healthy in orbit, both short duration, because we know even on a short flight we have fluid shifts, and on long flights where we have the potential of bone loss and radiation. So what I'd like to do is kind of give an overview on several different topics, and I'm going to use the word that's really vernacular called bioastronautics. This word has actually been through kind of a historical evolution. It was first used about 50 years ago, then replaced by a few other words, and then readopted about a decade ago. It's the field of bioastronautics, and it encompasses human health research in space, the adaptation and countermeasures. It includes the space medicine and the healthcare systems. So each time in the American system we fly, we typically have 2 crew medical officers. I've been one of them. We don't always have to have a medical background, but we are trained to treat Some illnesses, we're trained to suture wounds. For long-duration missions, astronauts have been trained to pull teeth, and you know what is in all of that drill. But it's also about developing the technology and the hardware to deliver that space medicine. The third part of that triangle in bioastronautics research is called Habitation and Environmental Monitoring. And this is really the key to closed-loop life support. It's the key to keeping us alive, because obviously we, in this mini Earth that we put in orbit around the real Earth, or we send to the moon, or we send onto Mars, we have to have oxygen to breathe, and we have to have something that cleans up the carbon dioxide that we expire. We have to have potable water on board. We have to care about the temperature, and we have to care about the pressure. So the habitation and environmental monitoring, that feedback loop that tells us where we are, is also very important. And that's all, again, encapsulated in this big triangle called bioastronautic elements and research. There are known changes to the human body, and there are unknowns. I'm not even going to quote the phrase unknown unknowns, but they're out there. It's the knowns that we can really point our research to, and they go back several decades when they first started to become evident. There are changes, as we know, to the neurovestibular system, both going to orbit from 1G to 0G, and for some people, but not all people, from going from 0G back to 1G. There are changes in the cardiovascular system because the heart does not have to work as hard. It's not pulling blood up from the feet to the head, and we've all experienced that. The heart is operating in a very quiescent environment and tends to atrophy in a way unless we stay cardiovascularly fit. It's one of the reasons we require our flight crew, the pilot and the co-pilot, who sit vertical on entry in the shuttle, to exercise so that as they have the G onset, the heart is strong enough to keep blood in the head along with your G suit helping. The immune system is, as Millie was talking, is a little bit of a relatively new development. And I say relatively because in 1990 on STS-32, we flew some immune experiments. They were the little needle pricks that went into the arm. 5 of us, Dan Brandenstein was the commander, and before the flight, of course, we took the measurements, and we're all very diverse. We've been exposed to all different kinds of things. After the flight, surprisingly, we looked very similar. Now, interestingly enough, the results would suggest that we were also more susceptible to illness, but none of us got sick. So that skin test was altered somehow by the environment. Even our response was altered by the environment, and it wasn't clear why. And if I say anything incorrect here, I know Millie will correct me. On my first flight in 1985, which was D1, a space lab flight, we actually did take lymphocytes, white cells, blood cells to orbit in a biorack, and we saw the changes there in vitro, outside of the body. And those changes have been replicated in vivo, inside of the body. So there is still much we need to learn. There is research out there and data which suggests that certain cells in a microgravity environment, whether they be mold or mildew, may be mutating differently and faster, and we should all be concerned about that. One of the most obvious challenges for long-duration spaceflight, as Millie was talking about, is bone-muscle systems. You know, as long as we're up there in 0G, we don't notice it, and we operate just fine. Of course, unless there was that event where we were doing an EVA, we've been up for a year, we haven't been exercising. The suit is hard. Mini suits, they're a balloon, are hard to work against, and there's always the potential of having a microfracture just because you're working against this very hard suit. That's one of the concerns for long-duration missions on even the moon, 90 days, 120 days, because we don't know the threshold of all of that loss, and what is the susceptibility to our bones to a spiral fracture, for example, in the suit on the surface after many months up there. So balance disorders, cardiovascular deconditioning, decreased immune function, muscle atrophy, and bone loss are all some of the effects of being in a weightless or partial gravity environment. In my last job at the Johnson Space Center, I was the associate director in space biomedical research and space and life sciences director, and my job was being part of risk assessment. We started biomedical research before we ever went to the moon, And those of you that flew, and Bill's not here, know that. Even in low Earth orbit in a 14-day mission, we were collecting biomedical data. We actually started before humans, as you know. We started with Abel and Baker and Ham of the primate species, collecting data to ensure that the mammals could fly. Then took that data into Apollo, collected it. There was so much we didn't know. There were physicians who weren't sure that the human cells would operate in a microgravity environment. There was so little that we knew back in those days. But we did make it to the moon, and we made it back. We're probably very fortunate we didn't have a major solar event because we probably weren't as well prepared as we should be. It isn't well known by many that Skylab was established primarily as a biomedical research laboratory. We flew 3 crews to it. The first flight, of course, was in 1973. The longest duration was 84 days. A condition of being assigned to that flight was, as Dr. Chris Kraft said, you had to be willing to be a guinea pig because we needed that data to go on to Mars. In 1973, Werner von Braun had a strategic plan that put us on the surface of Mars in about the year 2000. So we're 8 years late right now. And they knew that we had to understand what was happening in the weightless environment. If you've seen some of the pictures, they look like this. We flew our first flight surgeon on the lower right-hand side, Dr. Joe Kerwin, who went on to head the Space and Life Sciences Directorate at one time. We had bicycle ergometers. We did medical exams. And we conducted what was called the first whole-body human metabolic balance. What that meant is that all of the calories, all the composition of the food was measured and known, and every astronaut recorded what they consumed. And then aliquots, or specimens of both urine and feces, were collected and returned. That's where we first saw the loss of calcium out of the bones in the body. It's an 84-day flight. And of course, as more and more people started to fly in the Russian program, we started collaborating with Russia well before Apollo-Soyuz, and through Apollo-Soyuz, and even before Shuttle Mir, we continued that collaboration in sharing data. The shuttle flight gave us another opportunity to continue that research, and as Millie talked about, she was on what was called the SLS-1 mission, the first really dedicated space life sciences mission. But for most of us, we know that we flew some experiments almost every flight. The first 2 flights drove one experiment on fluid shift. It was the first time we had re-entered sitting up, and we had a significant blood pressure drop in the crew, and orthostatic intolerance, fainting. And we measured a loss of total body fluid of about 1 liter, and that happens, as you know, after the first 2 days. That's just part of equilibrating with the microgravity environment, but it changed the whole protocol for reentry. And as you know, now we drink 32 ounces of liquid and salt to try to replenish that liquid, so as we re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, that our heart has enough blood to pump to the brain, because the G-suit can only help you to a certain point. You need the rest of that inner body fluid. This slide is actually a little bit dated now. We've had more flights. I show this to many universities. If you look back at the history of the shuttle and the over 120 flights we've had and count the experiments, there are more than 2,000, more than 200 universities. We've flown even middle school experiments. We have graduated in the research hundreds and thousands of graduate students, and we've had a number of companies involved in this research. The shuttle is limited in duration, but even that limited duration has allowed us to do quite a bit of very groundbreaking research, because, as Millie pointed out, we can only do 1 G down here, and we have learned that cells care. They care whether it's 0, they care whether it's fractional. So what we've been really doing in the last 2 decades is compiling data on the 0 side and hoping that maybe in some cases it's a straight line between 1 and 0. We don't know. Unless we do centrifuge work in microgravity or actually have long-duration bases on the moon at 1/6 G, we're sort of guessing on where all the thresholds are. And this is my pretty picture launch. We've also used the mid-deck as a laboratory. It didn't begin that way. I had the great opportunity to be an engineer on the shuttle in the 1970s, worked for Rockwell International when we were doing the designs. And we thought that the mid-deck would be primarily the living area, the cooking area, the sleeping area. And we had put lockers in there, and we're sort of surprised that they weren't all taken up. And that gave birth to a new laboratory, and it's not a very romantic name, mid-deck experiments, MDE. Most people don't know what's in it. But we've had universities do their research there. Many of you who've flown the shuttle know that. Some of the early work in cardiovascular research was done. The ultrasound work, we did that in 1990. Lower body negative pressure work in crystal growth and many of the other physical sciences were done on the mid-deck of the shuttle. In 1983, we flew the first space laboratory in the payload bay of the shuttle. Space Lab was a cooperative effort with the European Space Agency. And in fact, when it was, the partnership was started in the 1980s, 1970s. It was a partnership with ESA and Germany to build a man-rated vehicle laboratory in a cooperative effort. ESA eventually built 2. I had the opportunity on my first flight to fly in number 2 when we flew D1, Deutschland 1, in 1985. Most of those experiments were from Europe, most of them from West Germany. This gave us a really great environment. It had power. It could power simultaneous experiments. It had venting. You could do crystal growth and vent overboard. It had data systems that could involve the ground-based researchers, so we gave birth to the POC, the Payload Operations Control Center, not only at the Johnson Space Center, but at the Marshall Space Flight Center. And now, with the station, you have researchers in our partner countries. So they can be in Europe, they can be in Japan, and other locations. We were able to simultaneously operate, as I mentioned, many different experiments, but whether or not the flight was focused on microgravity physical sciences, such as this one in 1950, nearly every flight had some medical component. And on this flight, where we had fluid physics on the left-hand side there out of Jet Propulsion Labs, and I'm putting a gallium arsenide crystal into a furnace for Vanderbilt University and one for Yale later on. Even so, we had packed behind those lockers things like a lower body negative pressure device. I flew it first on STS-32 in 1990, and then flew it again on STS-50 in 1992. And I can tell you, without showing you the numerical data, that it protected me because I was a guinea pig. I was not allowed to exercise for either my 11-day flight or my 13-day flight. And at least the data, I felt great. And the data showed that my anti-orthostatic intolerance was greatly enhanced or reduced, however you want to say it. It made a difference. I could tell it by the volume in my legs, and I could tell it by the color of my legs. For those of you who haven't flown in space, one of the first things you notice after a couple days is that your legs get very skinny. That's what they call the chicken leg. And they can also get very white. I was a subject for a muscle biopsy experiment on STS-32, and that biopsy was done about 2 weeks before the flight, and the principal investigator was from Washington State University here in Pullman, and it leaves a little tiny incision, a scar, and of course any scar is going to be red around the perimeter. Within the second day of orbit, I couldn't see the scar anymore. That told me I wasn't getting a whole lot of blood in that area of my skin, and I didn't know whether to be alarmed. I decided not to be alarmed. I decided to be academic. I monitored it, and I took data, took a picture. And then I went into LBNP about 4 days before entry, and was in it for about 4 hours a day. I don't remember if it was for all 4 days or every other day. And the color of my skin came back, and the scar became more visible. And I started being able to retain more liquid. You drink liquid as you are in that negative pressure device. And so, yes, when I signed up for this experiment, I was told I would not be able to do any research while I was in it, and I decided, well, I'm in a zero-gravity environment, and as long as they put me on an umbilical, I can just float around. And so I was able actually to do experiments in this lab on this flight with the lower body negative pressure device on my lower body. and it worked out quite well. I also had some time to fill out my logbook, which most flights didn't have time to do. So usually when I go to a school, I say, how do it work? But how does the physics work? Those of us who have flown know this phenomena, but in microgravity, there is no natural convection. This candle experiment on the left side was done on my third flight in 92. This was done in a glove box. It's just a very simple experiment showing that a birthday candle will burn differently between 1G and 0G. But of course, you have no natural buoyancy. But you can take advantage of certain phenomena, such as the lack of sedimentation, to do research. The picture on the right shows what a beaker of water and marbles might look like in 1G, and just below that, what it might look like in 0G. So there is a definite physical difference. We have used that physical difference to an advantage in biomedical research. About 15 years ago, and in fact, one of our astronauts, Dr. David Wolf, was the principal investigator on designing a new bioreactor, cellular biotechnology bioreactor that worked in zero gravity, and we were able to grow cells in a weightless type of environment. They don't sediment to the bottom of a beaker. They will actually coalesce into a three-dimensional mass. Dr. Jeannie Becker, who is now with NSBRI, was one of the researchers who found that cells outside the body in vitro that actually are able to assemble in a three-dimensional mass like they would in the body behave differently around different medications. And this was found in some cancer research. And this was really breakthrough because most of the work you get done in the lab, when you go to a hospital and they take a sample, they're going to grow in a petri dish and hope that if they test different things with it, it's going to respond the same way in your body. And that, in fact, may not be true. This gave rise to a large investment in bioreactor research, not only on the shuttle, and you see the shuttle flights listed there, but also on the Mir. And it paved the way for an agreement with the National Institute of Health and for the ISS. Regrettably, a lot of that research right now is being pressured by the budget, but it was quite breakthrough and was featured on the cover of several peer-reviewed medical magazines. So I'm going to talk about Shuttle Mir because Skylab was all about human research, collecting data to continue long-duration spaceflight, and so was Shuttle Mir. We embarked upon this partnership, as many of my colleagues out there know, to learn from each other, to dock a shuttle to a space station before we built the International Space Station, to work together after a long hiatus from Apollo-Soyuz, and to collect medical data and long-duration research. We the United States left 9 different crew members on board. John Blaha was one of them. And we participated in research that had been designed in the US, and we shared it with our Russian colleagues and our European colleagues because we did have still have an international working group that is addressing human spaceflight. I'm going to show a little bit of my flight film for those of you who have not seen the Shuttle Mir flights. It's hard to believe it was 10 years ago now. I was on the first flight and the 8th flight, and we had a 9th flight, and then the Mir was deorbited into the Pacific. My crew was composed of Terry Wilcutt, Joe Edwards, Michael Anderson, who, by the way, grew up in Cheney, Washington, here in the state, and who, sadly, we lost in 2003 on Columbia. Jim Riley, Salajan Sharapov, who was taking his first flight with us, and Andy Thomas, who we left on the Mir, and we picked up David Wolf. This is a picture of the Mir. You see the Soyuzes, and there should be a progress in that picture. And on the very top, you see the docking adapter that was delivered by the shuttle to the Mir that allowed the shuttle to dock to the Mir. This is an on-orbit picture. It shows you how you can efficiently pack 10 people, 3 on the Mir. The commander in the middle, Anatoly Solovyev, who was my commander when I trained in Russia in 1994, and Pavel Vinogradov, the flight engineer, and I think Pavel must be out here someplace as well. And then I can't quite see. And then, of course, Dave Wolf had been up there for 90 days with them, and we left Andy Thomas. We trained a little less than a year for this flight together as a crew, although Salijan joined us at about 6 months. It was a January flight, January 22nd, an evening night launch, so that was our dinner before we launched. We had 22 science and experiments on board, in addition to several thousand pounds of cargo that we'd be exchanging with the Mir. It was planned to be a 10-day flight, and it was a 10-day flight. And there's Mike and Andy and Salijan. Of course, walking out to the crew transport vehicle takes us to the pad. We had a space hab in the payload bay. That's where many of our experiments were located, and we had been training quite extensively on that. Some of the experiments were biomedical. Many of them were in preparation for building the International Space Station, which was started in October of that same year. Totally nominal countdown. We actually rolled heads up on this flight, which was interesting for me because it was my first heads up roll. And I thought it was probably the smoothest launch I had been on. And it was actually quite nice to be able to have the right, I could always tell when I was really upside down, even though they told me the gravity vector, the vector was through my body. So we had a nominal SRB SEP, and we started carrying mini cameras at that time. So we had one back on the flight deck, and you can look forward. And this is before we actually started to change over the glass cockpit, so we have the old CRTs in front. Terry's on the forward left, and Joe's on the forward right. Mike was in the flight engineer seat there to the bottom left, and then Jim was on the right. The other three of us were in the mid-deck on launch, and then Jim and I traded places on entry. We had our survival pressure suits on. We had a mix of the old and the new on that flight. They were just transitioning to the current suits. Opened the doors. It's, again, a standard rendezvous, about 2 days, but we opened up the lab first thing, and you can float in, and now you see all the lockers. Unlike Space Lab, which had racks of equipment, the Space Hab was composed of locker-size elements. Some contained experiments, others contained supplies for the Mir, and others just stowage for the Space Hab itself. Space Hab is operated off of IBM ThinkPad laptop computers. The first thing that we did, Mike and I did, was unstow the equipment for a piece of Japanese equipment. This is the real-time radiation monitoring device, and this is looking at the radiation flux through the South Atlantic anomaly. Probably some of you have been about ready to go to sleep through the anomaly, close your eyes, and all of a sudden see the retinal flashes. Well, that's the high-density flux through that area, and the Japanese were very interested in investigating that. This is also a radiation experiment. Those are Bonner balls with detectors in them, a number of candidate experiments that might be used to protect crew members in the future. We carried the EarthCam with us. This is Dr. Sally Ride's middle school system that they could take pictures of the Earth. We assigned Jim to an experiment from the University of Colorado. This is a soil experiment from civil engineering, but those of us in Seattle are probably very familiar with these kinds of soils. During an earthquake, they liquefy, so the buildings actually fall over. And the only environment in which they can simulate that compressibility or lack thereof is in a weightless environment. Finally, at the end of the second day, we are underneath the Mir. We have, of course, disengaged all of the auto systems, and it's now being manually flown by Terry, and all of the crew is participating. We have laser range finders, we have radar, and we're, as you know, all focused pretty heavily on that object. So on the left-hand side, you can see the docking adapter. It was a night docking. Terry did an outstanding job in, it's all about the closing speed, roll, pitch, and yaw, X, Y, and Z. We engaged the latches, pulled the two systems together, checked the pressure integrity at the interface, and then check the pressure between the modules so we can equalize, and then prepare to open the hatch. So on the other side of the hatch is Dave Wolf, and he's ending his 3-month stay. Terry's opening the hatch. And I know there's always a little bit of push and pull about who goes into whose module first. In this case, I think Terry was able to pull Anatoly in first so we could get pictures. I think we'd planned this, actually. And they were happy to see us. We brought mail from home, some gifts, some fresh food, and hopefully some good conversation. And it's all part of the psychological aspect of being up there for quite some time. So behind him is coming Pavel. And then behind him will come Dave Wolf. At this point, Dave becomes a member of our crew, and then we make Andy a part of the Russian crew. This is the traditional gift exchange held in the Mir base block. Unfortunately, now that I'm at a museum, I can't bring Mir back to exhibit it. It would have been wonderful. But so these are some of the last pictures. I think the final crew does have their own tour of the Mir. But as you float through, you can see some of the ducting at the bottom and many of the parcels taped to the wall. Part of our joint agreement was not just biomedical research, but bringing some of that biomedical research home in the shuttle, because it does have such a large down mass or cargo carrying capability, as well as bringing other items home from prior missions, as well as hardware which we were interested in doing failure analysis on, or just investigating, such as a solar array, which was brought in and then put in the space hab, and we brought it home. So we're going to the node at this point and reorienting ourselves to the particular module we're in. Part of the responsibility of the NASA US side was to outfit 2 of the modules, Priroda, which stands for nature, and Spectra. Unfortunately, Spectra was impacted by progress at one point, was closed off when we docked, and so we spent most of our research time in Priroda and exchanged out experiments so Dave could bring his home, including a bioreactor experiment, and we could leave one with Andy. Again, we're making large use of small laptop computers. Back in the space hab, we then staged quite a bit of the stowage we'd take over. These were bags that we transitioned over. And now Andy's in the mid-deck of the shuttle, and he's taking his bioreactor experiment. These are human breast cancer cells, and he'll take that over to the Mir. And they were allowed to coalesce into a single unified tumor over the next several months. What was very interesting about some of these cell masses is that they actually started to differentiate, that is, create their own vascular systems. Terry and I were the 2 crew medical officers, and we tested a new system called the telemedicine instrument package. We could collect any manner of data. It would then go down to the flight surgeons, and it was very, very sensitive. We even did stethoscope sounds. Finally, after 5 days, we closed the hatch. We've exchanged crew members. We've brought back the biomedical data that Dave generated. Some of it was conditioned. We have a capability for refrigerators on the shuttle, undocked, and then we began some engineering work. Every departing flight took pictures of the exterior of the Mir with our Hasselblads and the Nikons. We shared that data with our Russian colleagues in a common database, and that information was used in design or redesign, in some cases, of the International Space Station. We were looking for micrometeoroid indentations or holes in the solar rays, discoloration on the paints and the thermal protection systems, and something called atomic oxygen erosion on some systems. It really was quite a pretty event docking with this. It reminded me here when I was in Seattle as an undergraduate, coming downtown Seattle to the theater and watching 2001 and hoping that someday I might be able to dock with the space station. And while Mir wasn't rotating like the one in the movie 2001, it was even more spectacular to see it out there over the overhead window. Finally, after 2 revolutions around Mir, Joe flew. We performed a back-off burn, and we had about a day and a half left in the mission. Mike is doing some work here with a Canadian experiment that was eventually used with a Canadian robotic arm. This is a space vision system. This is actually how we assembled the space station together without direct view through the windows. We tested a device for measuring mass, because we can't measure weight, called the mass measuring device. All the crew members provided data. It's a very simple physics experiment. We carried an experiment for West Germany. These are swordtail guppies that gave birth in flight. And you'll know that notice they're not schooling. The vestibular system appears to be a little bit confused. But it was great entertainment for the crew. And finally, something I think we all share is the importance of windows. So whenever we had a chance, the Space Hab had a small window. We looked out the window. We exercised. We always put Terry and Joe on the bicycle first. We always had a camera in our hand as we looked out the overhead window. We had a number of sites we were looking at, and in the theme of this Congress, we were very interested in some El Nino sites. Joe is typing an email back to his wife from the ceiling of the middeck, and Mike is coming down with a daily teleprinter mail. They made a hometown movie for the middle school students in Cheney and Joe's hometown in Alabama. Those were M&Ms. And then we always have to demonstrate the property of fluid physics. This happens to be strawberry Kool-Aid. On several of my flights, we carried some more sophisticated instruments, some of them from the Jet Propulsion Labs, where we used acoustical boxes and acoustical wells to position the drops, and we could actually spin them and look at measure surface tension in liquids that did not lend themselves easily to that in a 1G environment. And Mike was very good at that. But you notice Joe had his towel around there, too. So deorbit day, beautiful mission, nothing, no anomalies. Everything worked perfectly. Closed the doors, performed a deorbit burn. And for those of you who did not have the cameras in the HUDs, we do have cameras in the HUDs now. So not only can we see it, the ground can see it as well. And as we're coming over, it's almost dusk, by the way, as we come over Florida. Again, a perfectly nominal entry. We had a beautiful day. As you can see, not a cloud in the sky. And I have to tell you that it was kind of a mixed blessing for me. It was a great flight. I was happy. We accomplished all of our research goals, all 22 experiments. We exchanged all our cargo, got our crew member back, but I knew that this was probably going to be my last flight, so I was trying to relish it there on the flight deck. And it's always amazing how fast it looks like it's falling when you're outside. So 400 feet, gear down. And I remember as an engineer for Rockwell, I used to watch this on the computer, and there were a lot of people who told me this would never work. So when you live long enough, you find out that sometimes you never want to say never. So good landing. Nose down at about 140 knots and rolled out. We were pretty much on the timeline from the nose stop till the crew egress, although by the time that we did get out, the sun had actually set. And I think Joe and Terry took great pride in the fact that the nose was on the center line of the runway. And we all felt great. I have to tell you, we all followed the protocols, all of the countermeasures. We fluid loaded, we exercised, although as a mission specialist I didn't get as much time as Joe and Terry. Still, when I had the opportunity, I did. And a 10-day flight, and we all did fine. We hoped that what we did was, in some small way, contributing to this International Space Station that's orbiting about us right now, with 3 people, with most of its laboratories on board, and that it can help us in the future as well as we plan for long-duration spaceflight, really long-duration spaceflight. We have the Unity laboratory up there, which is currently the home of the U.S. research. Now, Jeff and John Charles are not here, but I did want to just convey some information, a summary that what they would convey. That we have to identify the risks. It requires flight data and ground-based research in combination. That these are identified in what's called the Road Map, the Bioastronautics Road Map, which has been vetted on multiple occasions by the National Academies and the National Institutes of Health. It has a document number. It's called HRP 47052 Revision A, with last baseline in July 2007. And it establishes the flow down of requirements from the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate and the Office of the Chief Health Medical Officer to the HRP programs and to the development of the future vehicles. To develop those countermeasures, we require research. We need to know what 1, 0, 1, 6, and 1/3 mean, if these are the destinations that we go to. And that research is coordinated through the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, and all of these areas are summarized, the research, why we're doing it, and the partner universities or other government agencies on the website www.nsbri.org. I don't know if this is what a lunar base will look like, but I certainly hope that some of the kids that we educate and inspire at the Museum of Flight will have a chance to find out firsthand, either by the engineers or scientists who participate in it or by being a future crew member there. I hope that we're around to see humans on their way to Mars, and I don't know if this is what the base will look like, but I certainly hope we have that investment in the technology that's going to enable it sooner rather than later. And if one of you or some young person out there listening does visit Viking 1 and 2, which landed in 1976, our museum is waiting for it. So bioastronautics research, protecting the human organism during long-duration space exploration. We all need to support it, and we'll all depend upon it. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all speakers that they responded so marvelously to my calls of urgency, and we have actually saved some time now for the discussion. May I ask all speakers, okay, I should have told you, to come up on the podium and take their seats.
Thank you for all of your presentations, very enjoyable and interesting. Could any of you address the current situation with the space station solar array rotary joint situation and what the cause of the problem might be, what the repairs might be, and any implications for when the rest of the space station equipment might arrive based on that problem?
I've been talking to folks back home actually to find out exactly that answer, and it's not a simple one. Right now, the root cause, the biggest suspect for the root cause is perhaps having used a dry lubricant as opposed to a wet lubricant and having increased friction as a result. And so what's proposed is to go out on STS-126, the next shuttle mission to the station, and apply a wet lubricant that's been successful in space before to the joint, and then check the friction forces, which they can from the ground, look at the performance of the joint. Now, in parallel with that, there's a plan to basically bring up all the parts to put in a new joint, and that would involve 10 EVAs. That's a big number. And so that plan is on paper, people are working it, but both of these things are taking place in parallel, and I wouldn't say that anyone feels sure that they understand the root cause yet. I think we're all pretty interested to see the results from 126.
More questions, please.
Yeah, I guess for anyone, in terms of technical questions and the nature of our convention here is planetary stewardship, we're talking about the solar arrays, and somebody mentioned the batteries. And with the move towards electrical cars, I would think that's one of the technologies that might, in fact, be able to migrate back to Earth. What kind of batteries do you use on station? Does anybody know? And is there anything that reaches back to the stuff down here?
Pavel, you were commando.
Well, really, really big batteries. They of course, take some pretty wicked cycles. We go around 16 times a day, so they're charging half the time and discharging half the time. They have a really small temperature. I forget exactly the chemistry of the battery. Sorry, I didn't. When I was going through the training, that wasn't really all that interesting to me. But they have a very tight temperature control in order to maintain their longevity. We really carefully control, actively control the temperatures on the batteries out there. I'm not sure, I haven't heard anything directly about applications for battery power on Earth. To this point, touch wood, the batteries have done an admirable job. The Russian program has a lot deeper experience than we do in this, having had battery-powered space stations for a long time. We've been really pleased with how well the batteries are doing on station, but to answer your question directly, Bob, I don't know the answer.
Other facts? Okay, so that's our knowledge here. Tom? Feel free.
I think the chemistry is nickel metal hydride, and that's the technology. And because the station design got started so long ago, in the late 80s, that selection was probably advanced for its time, but now it's not as advanced as the lithium kinds of batteries that are being used in vehicles down here. So it might be the case that the space program is going to be searching the commercial world for battery technology to enable us to do things in space rather than this particular space station battery helping us out down here. But Carl Waltz was telling me, Carl, are you here this morning? Yeah. Carl was telling me that the NASA search for advanced battery technology for surface systems on the Moon and Mars, planetary spacecraft and so on, might be one of the drivers, the pioneering edges of battery technology that can then be used for more efficient use in vehicles down here. So space station, I think, is a generation behind where everybody else is, but they're very reliable and huge, as you said. Really big, right?
Of course, a couple of years from now, shuttle is going to be retired, and maybe there's going to be some more flights, and maybe there won't. But the question is mainly addressed to maybe all the international partners. Have you detected or have you started to feel the loss of that down mass? The encouraging words about ATV and HTV are good for up mass, but you won't have that down mass for operating station. I just wondered if you started to feel the effects of that yet.
Well, not from an international partner standpoint, but one of the biggest effects for down mass is science. The kind of science that you'd like to do where you actually bring something home and look at it on the ground. The good news for that is I think that the video technology has, and analytical technology that we've been able to bring on board have advanced quite a bit, certainly since my space station missions. And what I'm finding, I just completed training in the Columbus module, and what I'm hearing from investigators is that the bandwidth that they are able to bring down to the ground is actually quite adequate to do a lot of the investigations that they'd like to do into fluid physics and things like that. And so, because they knew they were limited on crew time, and they knew, I think, that down mass has always been a problem. Now it's more of a problem. They've been trying to rely on analysis that they can do on board, and I think that folks have been designing pretty successfully around that. Doesn't mean that there's not more things we could do if we could bring more things down.
And Dick, Cady and I have been going through training here together, and one of the things that's interesting is a lot of the experiments were designed before the realities of the lack of down mass were faced. And so their thought initially was that they were going to be able to bring down blood or urine or technical samples back to Earth. We're still planning to do that, but of course they can only right now come down with the crew in the descent module of the Soyuz. So it's really limited mass and volume, like the size of a shaving kit or something, that amount of stuff you can bring home. I think, in fact, it's going to drive us to do more science on board. And I think we're just coming to that realization that the Japanese have built a terrific laboratory. The Europeans have built a really good laboratory. We have centrifuges, we have glove boxes, we have analytical capability, we have microscopes. There's a lot of things that at first they thought they had to do automated for crew time concerns, and they'd be able to bring the stuff home. I think we're going to come around to the fact that we have 6 people up there and all of this capability, and now we're going to try and, just like you do on Earth, use the capabilities you have in situ to try and do the science that you can. There's also, I'm sure, as you know, the talk of trying to have a commercial unmanned vehicle that can safely return samples to Earth, but it's still the spacecraft of the future, and hopefully that will come to fruition, but it's not there yet.
as far as the HTV is concerned, we have been doing some studies of re-entry capability and landing, bringing up some samples on the ground safely. However, I'm not aware of how much it has matured. I haven't heard anything that there's no project team for down mass capability yet.
I think from my point of experience, I can only underline what Cady said. Experiments in space have to be robust and integrated. So from setting out the experiment and setting it up to the point of bringing down data, I have the experience of a couple of Soyuz missions landing in the steppes of Kazakhstan, and we had to bring out early stuff like blood samples or cellular samples cooled, and the whole chain is just not easy to guarantee. And so the experiments that don't so much rely on these things are better off than the ones that may, even in the shuttle case, have to deal with landing at Edwards instead of Florida. It happened, and you have to deploy a lot of infrastructure to do so. So that is an interesting experience, I think, also for the partners, that as far as possible we should analyze our experiments already inside in the ISS.
You've shown us how we've made the station so much more capable. I fear we've also made it so much more complex. Could you talk to us for just a minute about the training? Chris and Cady, you two are going through the training right now.
It might be interesting for the perspective of all of the flyers in the room, the way we do it right now. Cady and I both flown a couple times in space already, and even with that background, both of us being already robotics qualified and all of the, what you might call the fundamentals of the preliminaries, it's still about a 2-year training flow, and about 60% of your time is away from Houston, I would say, approximately, about 40% of the time in Houston, depending. For example, I haven't been back in Houston since July. So the training takes place at all of the various centers. The double-edged sword of an international program is that it's international, and so we spend time training in Scuba, in Cologne, in Montreal, in Star City, and in Houston. The training, compared to what most of the guys in the front row here went through, I would say the training is less in-depth, less technical. You do not learn the space station vehicle like you guys learned the vehicles that you flew, or like I learned the shuttle, or Cady learned the shuttle the first time we flew that. The space station is operated from the ground, and we need to learn enough to be able to react appropriately only for the things that we can do, which is a very small subset of a structure that size. So it's a different type of training. It's a lot of trying to understand the overall system. We become the integrators of all 16 nations at times, where the person that's training you in Cologne really knows their system, but doesn't know much about the rest of the station. Same in Star City, same in Houston. So we have to take what one entity is telling us and try and integrate it internationally into how we're truly going to operate. And the newness of Columbus and the newness of the Japanese segment also manifests itself in a lot of immaturity in their operations plans that will come with time. Just like when the ARM first up, we had a terrible operational plan, and over the years we've gotten better at it. So all of that tends to increase the burden of training. And then the last part is, it's not too bad with a shuttle crew or an Apollo crew with the people together to get ready together on the day of launch with all the things you need to know. You can have your simulators in Florida. You can have all of the training facilities where you need them. You can even bring a trainer down to Florida to get you ready for the real key stuff. If you're going to launch on the Soyuz, after having trained all over the world, you have to go down to Kazakhstan a couple weeks before launch. You have to have spent the time in Star City 4 or 5 weeks before that. So to maintain currency on spacewalking with the American suit, on robotics and all the different types of robotics, and all of the various systems becomes a real training problem to solve. And we've looked at all different ways to try and simplify that, to try and make sure that we get the skills that we need at launch time, and then maybe even more importantly, how to practice and hone and prepare those skills on orbit. So maybe 6 months after you last saw a simulator, you can go do whatever it is you have to do up there. So it's quite a different training world, Bo, than it was even a decade ago when we flew on the shuttle for the first time.
I think we think a lot about skill-based versus task-based training. You know, if you teach somebody to be a robotics operator that understands that every time they're going to move that arm, they need to think about what are the critical clearances, you know, what are the things that I need to look around and make sure that those things are in place before I move that arm. You'd like to think that person could do any robotics task. Sometimes when you add a time pressure on top of that, say for a docked mission when things need to happen faster, you might want to train specifically that task, specifically, you know, what visually are you lining up when you mate those two trusses together. But in general, for station, I think that we need to be more skill-based. In other words, that you teach, you know, us the basics of how to think about things and then put what we really need to know in the procedures. Now, on the other end of that spectrum is a set of procedures that has every single little thing that says, oh, and by the way, don't bump your head when you open the door to that refrigerator. And it says it actually on every page. And pretty soon I see that little warning, and I just go, yeah, that refrigerator warning, and I don't read it. And so there's that set of procedures that are too specific, and yet one of the challenges I've found in going around and going to all these different places for training is, as much as I appreciate the insights that the trainers share, unless they're in the procedure or in a small set of notes that I plan to bring with me, I'm not going to remember them. Maybe I've just gotten older, and I guess I have, but I'm not going to remember those really specific insights unless I decide they're important enough to put on that list of mine or they're in the procedure. And so often that's a perspective that's hard to share with the trainers whose whole job is to share everything they know with you, whereas our job is to think, what's this going to be like for me? What am I going to know 2 weeks from now or a year from now? And that gets back to what Chris said about, you know, how to be current for your actual launch. And I think all of us just do our best to, you know, think about what are our things that we're not good at and think about our things that we're good at and try to balance out how we personally address the training. But I'd still say that you still need to take your training plan as a personal thing and make sure that you're getting what you need out of it.
One last thing, Bo. We have three people at a time on the Soyuz. And so you end up with a rotating crew of 6, but they're staggered. So how do you decide what skill set you need in every group of 3 that launches?
Because you're going to have a time when, you know, a short period during this indirect handover that there are only 3 people on the station.
So how do we have those 3 people, and how do we train them with the right skill set so they will mesh so that we can do everything when we're on board? We've identified specialist, operator, and user skills for everything we do on board, and we need to make sure we have the right number of specialists for each thing, operators for each thing, and users for each thing, just so we don't break the back of training and make it a life's work just to train for one flight.
And with that, I would like to close the session, and I'm sure that the discussions will go on the subjects that we touched this morning. Thank you again.